The billionaire gets in the car and a poor girl says, "Shut up." The reason was unbelievable. An immense underground parking lot was submerged in a heavy silence, broken only by the distant echo of footsteps and the constant hum of fluorescent lights. Richard Jones, the billionaire founder of Zeta Tech Group, was walking to his car, his mind occupied with the numbers and contracts for the next day's meeting. Everything seemed normal until he opened the door of his black BMW and slid into the driver's seat, and something completely unexpected happened. A small, firm hand covered his mouth. Richard's eyes widened, instinctively ready to react, but he froze when he felt the gaze of the person behind him. It was a girl who could not have been more than 9 years old. She stared at him with wide eyes, full of fear but also urgency. Her low, sharp voice cut through the silence. "Shut up. Don't say a word. They might be listening." Richard, a man accustomed to controlling rooms full of executives, investors, and journalists, felt his heart race in a way it hadn't in years. The small hand and the child's desperate expression held him in a suspense that made no sense. Who was she? What did she want? Alice Brown, as he would only discover later, was trembling with nerves, but kept her hand firm. Her braided hair swayed as she looked back toward the immense company building. Her voice dropped even lower. "I heard them. Your partner and that blonde woman. They said that tomorrow you won't have anything left, that you're going to sign papers without realizing it." Richard blinked, trying to process it. His partner, Eduardo Moreira, and his assistant, Patricia Nogueira, people he had trusted for years. The girl spoke as if she had seen a ghost. He finally gently moved her hand away and whispered, "But how did you get in my car?" The cleaner left the door open when she left. "I hid because I saw them talking up there." Alice's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "They laughed at you. They said you're an obedient little dog and that tomorrow everything will be theirs." The words hit Richard like a punch. A lump formed in his throat. For years, he had believed that loyalty was the foundation of everything. But now a street child was warning him about the greatest betrayal of his life. He tried to remain calm, but inside, panic began to grow. Who was this girl to risk so much? Why warn him? Alice seemed to read his thoughts as she finished. "My grandmother always said, when you see someone being trampled on and you can help, you help, because tomorrow it might be you." Richard took a deep breath. In the rearview mirror, the lights on the 10th floor were turning off one by one. Eduardo and Patricia were probably coming down. They believed their plan was perfect. What they didn't know was that an unlikely warning had just turned the game around. And Richard, for the first time in a long time, didn't know if he was about to lose everything or start fighting as he never had before. Richard kept his hands on the steering wheel but didn't start the car. His heart was beating so fast he could feel the blood pulsing in his ears. The girl remained in the back seat, her eyes fixed on the rearview mirror, as if expecting someone to appear in the parking lot at any moment to drag them out of there. "Do you have any idea what you're saying?" he whispered, trying to sound calm, but his voice failed him. Alice shrugged as if she were already used to not being taken seriously. "I heard every word. They said that tomorrow you're going to sign without reading, that you're going to smile and think you're rich, but by the time you realize it, it'll be too late." Richard gripped the steering wheel tightly. Eduardo Moreira, his partner for almost 20 years. Patricia, his loyal assistant, who knew his schedule, his passwords, his habits. It was absurd to imagine they could betray him, but the girl's look didn't seem made up. It was the look of someone who had seen danger up close. "Why were you up there?" he asked, frowning. "How could a child hear this?" Alice took a deep breath, as if she had repeated that story to herself many times. "I sometimes stay in the hallways at night. I sleep where I can find space. The guard doesn't care. He pretends he doesn't see me. Today, when I passed by the meeting room, the door was ajar. They were talking loudly, laughing at you. I hid. If I hadn't heard, you would be lost." The words echoed inside him, Lost. Richard felt a shiver run down his spine. He didn't want to believe it, but recent memories began to align like puzzle pieces. The way Eduardo pressured him to trust more and review documents less. The times Patricia seemed to have too much access to conversations that were interrupted when he entered. Suddenly, Alice leaned forward and whispered with even more intensity, "Look!" She pointed to the rearview mirror. Richard saw the reflection of two silhouettes. Passing by the parking lot entrance, he immediately recognized Eduardo's confident posture and Patricia's elegant walk. His stomach churned. "They said you would be here now," Alice whispered, shrinking into the seat. Richard almost started the car, but held back. If he drove away quickly, he would draw attention. He needed to appear normal, but sweat was already running down his forehead. He swallowed hard and asked, "Why are you helping me? What do you get out of this?" Alice took a moment to answer. Her large, moist eyes shone in the dim light. "Because I know what it's like when no one believes you, when people treat you like you're invisible. They were talking about you as if you were stupid, and that made me angry." Richard turned to face her. For the first time in a long time, he felt a lump in his throat that didn't come from business, but from humanity. That girl, with nothing to lose, was giving him the greatest gift, the truth. And that night, he began to wonder if the entire empire he had built was about to fall because of the blind trust he had always had. Richard kept the car off, as if starting the engine would awaken a nightmare he could no longer escape from. His hands were sweaty, and his chest was tight, as the image of his partner and assistant coming down from the building burned in his mind. Eduardo, the man with whom he had shared dreams and businesses for 2 decades. Patricia, who seemed so loyal, she knew every detail of his routine. And now, that girl was saying that the two of them were ready to destroy him in a single day. Alice, huddled in the back seat, seemed even more alert than he was. Her eyes shone like headlights, watching every shadow in the parking lot. There was no ordinary fear there. There was survival. "I don't know what to think," Richard murmured. "I've spent my life believing in loyalty. I built everything on trust." Alice raised her chin, her voice firm despite her age. "Sometimes the people who smile at you the most are the ones who want to see you fall the most. My grandmother said a snake only bites those who get close." The words sounded like a slap. Richard had always believed that generosity was strength, but now he felt like a fool. How many times had he heard Eduardo telling him to relax, to let him handle the negotiations? How many times had Patricia had him sign papers already highlighted with colored markers, assuring him it was just routine bureaucracy? He took a deep breath, trying to push away the lump that was growing in his throat. "You said they laughed at me. What else did you hear?" Alice clasped her hands in her lap, hesitated, then spoke. "They said that you don't even notice things, that you trust so much it's too easy to fool you." The blonde woman laughed. "She said that tomorrow after you sign, you'll have to look for another job." Richard's chest burned. The empire he had built with effort seemed about to be snatched from his hands, and the worst part, by the people he believed in the most. He turned and looked intently at Alice. The girl didn't look away. For a moment, he saw something in her eyes that he didn't see in executives, advisors, or investors. Truth. "You risked your life to tell me this, didn't you?" he said, surprised by his own emotion. Alice gave a half smile, tired but sincere. "If I had stayed quiet, tomorrow might have been too late. I know what it's like to lose everything without anyone to defend you." Richard felt a shiver for the first time in years. Someone who had nothing to gain was by his side. And even though she was just a little girl, Alice might be the only one capable of saving him from the fall. Richard drove slowly out of the parking lot, the headlights illuminating the cold city night. The silence between him and Alice seemed to scream louder than any words. At every corner, his mind spiraled, replaying conversations, meetings, and laughs that now sounded false. It was as if every gesture from Eduardo and every smile from Patricia had gained a hidden, poisonous meaning. "Are you sure about this?" he murmured, still afraid to believe a story that would change everything. "You might have been mistaken, Alice." The girl sighed deeply, settling into the back seat. "I know when people are serious, and I know when they're talking bad about others. They laughed at you. They planned everything. It wasn't a joke." Her conviction made every word weigh like lead. Richard took a deep breath, staring at his own reflection in the rearview mirror. The elegant, confident man he used to see wasn't there anymore. In his place was a tired face, marked by doubt and betrayal. "I spent my life believing that trust was strength," he said almost to himself, "but maybe it was just naivety." Alice leaned forward, her face lit by the passing streetlights. "It's not wrong to trust. It's wrong not to notice when they treat you like an idiot. My grandmother said that when someone calls you a friend while preparing a trap, they're not a friend, they're a predator." The words hit home. Richard thought about how many times Eduardo would hug him in public, how many times Patricia would say, "Trust me," as if repeating a mantra. The truth began to seep in like water into cracks, impossible to contain. "If what you're saying is true, they don't just want to fool me, they want to destroy me completely," he murmured. Alice just nodded, serious. Minutes later, Richard parked in front of an almost deserted cafe. He needed time to think, to organize the avalanche that was pouring over his mind. He ordered a coffee. As Alice devoured a sandwich, with the hunger of someone who didn't know when her next meal would be, the contrast between them was painful. He, a millionaire, surrounded by luxury. She, a child used to surviving on scraps and in dark corners. Suddenly, his phone vibrated. A message from Eduardo. "Ready for tomorrow, partner. It's going to be historic. The investors are going to love it." Richard showed it to Alice. "He pretends to be a friend," she said with irony, "but behind your back he's sharpening the knife." Richard took a deep breath. This was no longer just suspicion. It was confirmation that the girl wasn't lying. He needed proof. He needed someone he could truly trust. And a name came to his mind, David Ramos, a former investigator whom Eduardo had fired under the excuse of budget cuts. Maybe he was the missing piece to turn the game around. As Alice finished the sandwich, Richard made the decision that would change everything. He would not be the victim. The next morning, Richard woke up with a heavy head and swollen eyes. He had slept little, disturbed by the memory of the girl covering his mouth in the car and by the cruel phrases she had repeated about Eduardo and Patricia. Sitting at the table, he stirred his breakfast without an appetite, while Alice watched in silence, wrapped in a blanket he had found in the closet. The child seemed out of place in that luxurious apartment, but her attentive gaze didn't miss a thing. "Aren't you going to work today?" she asked, biting a piece of bread. Richard shook his head. "If I show up there now, they'll notice something has changed. I need to be careful." Alice looked at him seriously. "Or you need someone who knows how to play this game. Who do you trust?" The question sounded like a challenge. Richard thought about old colleagues, company directors, even distant relatives. But no name gave him a sense of security until the memory of David Ramos came up like a spark. The former investigator had been fired by Eduardo under the justification of budget cuts. At the time, Richard had believed it without question. Today, that decision sounded different, almost like a calculated move to get rid of a man who asked too many questions. "David," he murmured. "He might be the key." A few hours later, he parked in front of a modest house in a distant neighborhood. Alice had insisted on coming with him. Richard hesitated, but the girl's firmness convinced him. When the door opened, David appeared with the same hard expression Richard remembered. A 45-year-old man with stubble, sharp eyes, and hands marked by scars. He narrowed his eyes when he saw Richard. Then he looked at Alice, curious. "I thought you would never look for me again," David said, crossing his arms. "What happened?" Richard took a deep breath. "It turns out you might have been right all along." They went inside. The simple room contrasted with the luxurious offices Richard frequented. Alice sat down discreetly in a corner, but watched every detail. Richard explained in a low voice everything the girl had heard. David remained silent, just nodding occasionally. When he finished, the former investigator let out a short, humorless laugh. So they finally showed their fangs. I already knew Eduardo wasn't trustworthy. And Patricia? I always had the impression that she smiled more than she should. I need proof, Richard said, his voice firm for the first time since the night before. If I go to the meeting tomorrow with nothing, I'll be lost. David looked at Alice. And you, little one, aren't you afraid of getting involved in this? She raised her chin. I am afraid, but it's worse to stay quiet and watch someone get trampled on. The investigator raised an eyebrow, surprised. You have courage. Maybe more than a lot of adults I know. Richard realized at that moment that he wasn't alone. The game was starting to change. David opened a worn folder on the table and took out an old laptop covered in faded stickers. He turned on the device, and while the files were loading, he looked at Richard seriously. You came to me late, but not too late. Eduardo and Patricia have been planning this for a long time. I bet there are already traces if we know where to look. Richard ran a hand through his hair, distressed. They know my every move. Patricia organizes my schedule, my documents, even my trips. Eduardo knows how I think. It's as if I handed them the key to my life. Alice, sitting beside him, frowned. But if they know everything about you, you also know things about them, right? The silence settled. Richard realized he had never thought that way. He knew habits, vices, and secrets he had always ignored. David smiled slightly at the girl's insight. This little girl is right, he said. Traitors almost always leave clues because they believe no one will look. For hours, they sifted through old records. Alice helped, holding notes, asking things that made Richard think. What seemed childish revealed a surprising logic. At one point, David found something suspicious. Bank transfers to an unknown company created just 2 years ago. Look at this, he said, turning the screen to Richard. Noguera Consulting, registered in the name of a distant cousin of Patricia's. Amount moved, 5 million. Richard felt a tightness in his chest. I never authorized that. Of course. Not, David replied. They disguised it as an international consulting payment. It's pure and simple fraud. Alice's eyes widened. So it's true, they're stealing from you. Richard clenched his fists. Every line of those statements was like a stab. The empire he had built was being torn apart from within. And to think Eduardo always talked about brotherhood and friendship. David continued the search and found even more contracts signed electronically at times when Richard was traveling. Phantom clients created to justify transfers. It was a complex network, but not invisible to an attentive investigator. They're not just planning to fool you with the merger, David explained. They've already siphoned off millions. Tomorrow's meeting is just to end the game, forcing you to sign papers that legitimize everything. Then you'll be discarded. Richard leaned back in the chair, the weight of the revelation crushing his shoulders, but when he looked at Alice, he saw that she didn't. Seemed scared. On the contrary, there was firmness in her eyes. See, she said, I wasn't lying, but now you have a way to fight. Richard took a deep breath. The flame of hope, once extinguished, began to rekindle. Maybe there was still time to turn the game around. Night fell heavy on the city as Richard, David, and Alice remained seated around the table, surrounded by notes, printed statements, and screens full of evidence. The air was charged with tension. It was as if every word spoken could be heard on the other side of the wall, where invisible enemies were waiting to attack. They have an advantage because they believe you're blind, David said with a firm voice. And walking into the room tomorrow, pretending ignorance will buy you time. The key is to act exactly as they expect. Richard frowned. In other words, like an obedient idiot, David nodded. Exactly. You have to pretend to be the same man as always, but behind the smile you'll have to be prepared for the final blow. Alice, who who had been watching everything in silence, raised her voice. "My grandmother said that a snake only feels safe when it thinks no one sees it. So you have to let them believe they're hidden." The girl's words echoed in Richard's mind. It seemed absurd to depend on a child at such a critical moment, but she saw truths that he had ignored for years. "And how are we going to expose everything?" he asked. His voice was filled with contained despair. David opened a folder and took out a small recorder. "We already have proof in the documents, but we need something irrefutable, a confession. They are arrogant, they like to talk too much. Tomorrow, if you provoke them, they'll give themselves away." Richard took a deep breath, imagining the confrontation. He felt the weight of 15 years of partnership with Eduardo and a decade of blind trust in Patricia. Now, every remembered smile sounded like poison. "What if it goes wrong?" he asked in a low voice. "What if they realize I know?" David looked at him seriously. "Then you'll lose everything, not just the company. You'll carry the mark of naivety forever." The silence was cut by Alice. "But if it works, you'll show that you're not weak. You'll show that you won't let yourself be trampled on." Richard looked at her, surprised. That girl who slept in shelters and hid in dark corridors now seemed to be the missing voice inside him. "You have too much courage for your age," he said almost in a whisper. Alice shrugged. "When you have nothing, you learn that courage is the only thing they can't steal." Richard closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, the decision had been made. The next day, he would face Eduardo and Patricia with a smile on his face. He would pretend to be vulnerable, but at the right moment he would reveal the trap. The silent war had begun. The clock marked 10 in the morning when Richard entered the Zeta Tech Group building. The cold air conditioning was not enough to stop the sweat on the back of his neck. Each step through the lobby seemed heavier than the last. Employees smiled and greeted him as always, without imagining that on that very day, the fate of the company would change forever. In the mirrored elevator, Richard faced his own reflection. The impeccable suit hid a racing heart. He needed to appear calm, naive, exactly as Eduardo and Patricia expected. It was a dangerous but necessary act. When the doors opened on the executive floor, Eduardo was already there, waiting. Smiling, charming, the partner opened his arms as if receiving a brother. "Sleep well, Richard. Today's the big day." Richard forced a smile and returned the hug, even as his stomach churned. "I slept well, partner. I'm excited." Patricia appeared right behind him, holding a leather folder. Her smile seemed maternal, but her eyes shone with the coldness of someone hiding secrets. "Good morning, boss. I reviewed all the contracts, marked them with yellow sticky notes as always. You just have to sign." Richard nodded without showing anything but confidence. Inside, every word sounded like poison. As he walked down the hallway toward the conference room, he felt a vibration in his pocket. A short message from David. "We're ready. Alice is with me." Richard took a deep breath. He wasn't alone. In the room, the table was already set. Bottles of water, organized folders, screens ready for the presentation. Eduardo pulled out a chair for him with the air of a host sure of his victory. "The investors arrive at 2, the partner said, adjusting his blazer. "Until then, we just need to review the final details." Patricia placed the folder in front of him and slid a golden pen closer to his hand. "It's all there, Richard. Trust us, as you always have." The words echoed in his mind like a sentence. Trust us. Exactly what Alice had repeated the night before. He looked up, and for a second, Patricia seemed to notice something different in his gaze, but arrogance quickly overcame doubt. She smiled again, convinced that he was completely in her hands. Richard opened the folder, pretending to examine the papers. His heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his face serene. "It's a lot of bureaucracy. It's a good thing I have you to guide me." Eduardo laughed. "That's what friends are for, isn't it?" Inside, Richard felt his blood boil. Friends. That word, once sacred, now seemed like a rotten mask. He knew that in a few hours he would have the chance to tear it off. In the cafe, across the street, David was discreetly adjusting the headphones connected to a small recorder. On the table, he looked like just another customer working on a laptop, but every move was calculated. Beside him, Alice watched intently, her eyes too sharp for a child her age. "Can you hear?" she asked in a low voice. David nodded. "Yes. The micro-transmitter I put in Richard's pocket is working. Every word from Eduardo and Patricia will be recorded. If they're arrogant enough to incriminate themselves, we'll have enough ammunition." Alice rested her chin on her hands. "They'll give themselves away. People who think they've won always talk too much." The maturity in the girl's voice impressed the investigator. For a moment, he wondered how many times that child had had to learn the hard way not to trust people. Meanwhile, in the conference room, Richard continued his role as the naive man. Eduardo spoke with enthusiasm about the profits that would come with the merger, while Patricia opened charts on the projector, explaining technical clauses that supposedly weren't worth reviewing. "Richard, here's one of the main points," Patricia said, tapping a page with her polished fingernail. "If you sign today, it ensures that the investors see you as a trustworthy leader." Richard leaned in, pretending to have difficulty understanding. "I confess, these terms confuse me, but that's why I have you, isn't it?" Eduardo laughed, satisfied. "Exactly. You never had to worry about bureaucracy. We always left that in our hands." The words, said with pride, were crystal clear in David's headphones. He typed quickly, recording the time and the segment. Alice stretched to peek. "They're hanging themselves, aren't they?" "They are, little one." David gave a rare smile. "But we still need a direct confession." Suddenly, Richard's phone vibrated discreetly. A short message from David. "Keep going. They're close to incriminating themselves." Richard took a deep breath, keeping his expression neutral. Patricia spoke again, her voice sweet and hiding the poison. "Trust us. Tomorrow you'll be able to rest. Just imagine a peaceful retirement far from worries." Richard looked up, holding back his anger. "Rest? I'm not that old." Eduardo completed without realizing the trap he was creating. "After tomorrow, you won't own anything anymore. But believe me, we'll take better care of the company than you ever did." The recorder captured every syllable. David and Alice exchanged glances. It was the missing piece. The clock on the wall marked almost noon when Richard realized he couldn't prolong that charade much longer. With every fake smile from Eduardo, with every sweet and poisonous word from Patricia, his blood boiled. But he had to wait. Victory would come at the right time, and any rush could ruin everything. He slowly leafed through the contracts, feigning indecision. Inside, he remembered the sleepless nights building Zeta Tech Group, the first clients. He won with difficulty, the debts that almost sank him, and the times he believed Eduardo was more of a brother than a partner. Now all those memories seemed distant, tinged with the bitter taste of illusion. The conference room felt suffocating. The air conditioning hummed, but didn't relieve the heat burning in his chest. Outside, the late morning sky was reflected in the tall windows, creating a white light that was blinding. That space, once a symbol of achievements, was now the stage for betrayals. Patricia leaned closer to him, her voice as smooth as honey. "Richard, trust me. I've reviewed every detail. Everything is perfect." He looked up, forcing a smile. "I know I can count on you. I always have." The phrase came out filled with irony, but she didn't notice. The self-confident sparkle in her eyes showed that she was convinced the trap was ready. Eduardo, beside her, tapped his fingers on the table like someone who couldn't contain his anticipation for victory. Meanwhile, in the cafe across the street, David reviewed the recorded segments with attention. Alice nibbled on a cookie, her restless eyes fixed on the screen. "They've already said horrible things. Why isn't that enough? Because we need them to talk about numbers. The money siphoned off, the plan to take him out of command," David explained patiently. "The more details, the stronger the case will be." Alice crossed her arms and replied firmly, "They talk about him as if he were an idiot. That should be enough." David smiled wryly. Maybe we should have more kids in place of lawyers." In the conference room, Eduardo raised a glass of water and toasted in the air. "Tomorrow will be historic. We'll finally take control, and you, Richard, will be able to rest without carrying that weight." The phrase fell like poison, but Richard kept his face serene. He pretended to laugh. "Resting. It sounds good." His phone vibrated again. Another short message from David. "We're ready. Almost there. Hold. Tight." Richard rested his hands on the table, taking a deep breath. He looked at Eduardo, then at Patricia. At that moment, he no longer saw them as partners or friends. He saw disguised predators, believing he was the perfect prey. But what they were ignoring was that the silent lamb had already grown sharp fangs, and when the time came, they would be the trapped hunters. At exactly 2 p.m., the elevator doors opened, and 3 Japanese investors appeared on the executive floor. They wore impeccable suits, every gesture filled with politeness and formality. Eduardo almost jumped out of his chair to greet them, a wide smile on his face, as if he were the true owner of the company. Patricia followed right behind, adjusting the leather folder close to her body, as she nodded with a posture that mixed reverence and false modesty. "Welcome," Eduardo exclaimed, bowing slightly. "It's an honor to have you here at this historic moment." Richard remained seated for a few seconds, taking a deep breath. Then he stood up, greeting them firmly. His handshake was secure, but his mind was racing. He needed to balance the image of the leader he had always been with the appearance of naivety that was part of the game. The investors sat at the table, observing the environment with discretion. One of them, Mr. Tanaka, adjusted his glasses and commented in halting English, "We hope this partnership brings mutual benefits." "Certainly," Eduardo replied, rushing to open the presentation. Slides. "Zeta is ready to take the next step." As he spoke, Patricia placed the contracts in front of Richard, discreetly pushing the golden pen closer to his hand. The gesture seemed small, but it was the culmination of years of carefully planned betrayal. Richard kept his expression calm, pretending not to notice the subtle pressure. He opened the documents, turning the pages slowly. Inside, he remembered Alice's words. "They think you're an obedient little dog. Prove you're not." Across the street, David followed everything through the headphones. Alice, restless, swung her legs under the cafe table. "They're almost telling him to sign, aren't they?" "They are," David confirmed, keeping his eyes fixed on the recorder. "But he knows what he's doing. Now is when we need to have nerves of steel." Back in the room, Eduardo leaned over and whispered in Richard's ear, as if giving a friend advice. "Sign without fear. After today, your life will never be the same." Richard held the pen, letting the silence linger for long seconds. Everyone watched him anxiously. Eduardo and Patricia exchanged glances of victory. The investors waited seriously, and Richard, inside, felt that the show was about to begin. The curtain hadn't fallen yet, but the stage was set. Richard held the pen between his fingers, spinning it slowly, as if he were undecided. The silence in the room seemed deafening, and even the hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than normal. Eduardo and Patricia exchanged glances, certain that they were about to witness the definitive victory. But instead of signing, Richard closed the folder calmly and looked up. "Before we proceed," he said in a neutral tone, "I'd like to share something with everyone." The phrase sounded simple, but it was like a lightning bolt in the room. Patricia immediately stiffened, her fingers trembling slightly over the leather folder. Eduardo tried to hide it, smiling tensely. "Of course, Richard, if you want to make a speech for the investors, feel free." Richard adjusted his tie and walked to the head of the table, positioning himself so that all eyes were on him. 15 years ago, I founded this company with the idea that trust was the basis of any partnership. I believed that loyalty and friendship could be stronger than any contract. The words echoed through the silent room. Patricia bit her lower lip, and Eduardo crossed his arms, restless. For a long time, Richard continued, I thought I didn't need to. Look at the details. I trusted too much. And as they say, when you're not paying attention, there's always someone ready to take advantage. Patricia cut in, trying to sound firm. I think we should stay focused on the merger. The investors didn't come here to hear. They came to hear the truth, he interrupted her firmly, looking directly at her. The Japanese investors looked at each other in silence. Mr. Tanaka frowned, adjusting his glasses. The youngest, Mr. Sato, leaned discreetly forward, visibly intrigued. Even the third gentleman, Mr. Yamazaki, who had not spoken at all, scratched his chin, watching Richard's every move with attention. Eduardo cleared his throat, trying to regain control. What's this all about? Are you nervous, Richard? We all know you never liked bureaucracy. Richard smiled, almost imperceptibly. It's true, Eduardo. I never liked bureaucracy, but I learned that ignoring it can be very costly. Across the street, Alice's eyes widened as she listened. Through David's headphones. He's starting, isn't he? She whispered. He is, David replied, recording every second. Now is the moment they start to sweat. In the room, Richard slowly opened another folder, different from the one Patricia had placed in front of him. It was thicker, full of documents and colored dividers. When he placed it on the table, the sound echoed like a muffled thunder. Eduardo and Patricia turned pale. Patricia reached out her hand as if to stop him, but pulled back. What would that be? Eduardo asked, his voice failing. Richard stared at the two of them, firm. Let's just say it's the real contract. The contract of truth. Richard opened the thicker folder calmly, as if he were in no hurry. He took out a pile of documents held by metal clips. The sound of the paper being placed on the table made Patricia shrink in her chair. Eduardo maintained his forced smile, but his hands shook on the table, betraying his anxiety. These are internal reports, Richard said, turning the pages so everyone could see. Suspicious transfers, fake contracts, shell companies, 2 years of a meticulously constructed scheme. The investor's eyes narrowed. Mr. Tanaka leaned in, observing the papers seriously. This is very serious. Eduardo laughed, but his voice sounded nervous. Richard, what are you doing? These papers don't mean anything. It's just interpretation. Interpretation? Richard held up another sheet, showing a signature identical to Eduardo's on a contract for a phantom company. This is your signature, Eduardo. Do you recognize it? The silence was deafening. Patricia cleared her throat, trying to find a way out. There must be some mistake. Richard didn't let her finish. The mistake was believing you could fool me forever. His voice was firm, sharp. I trusted you. I gave you power, access, opportunities, and you repaid me by trying to destroy me. Across the street, Alice clapped her hands on the cafe table, excited. I knew it. Now, they can't escape. David, more contained, smiled wryly. It's only the beginning, little one. Their fall needs to be public and definitive. In the room, Eduardo no longer hid his anger. You can't prove anything. This is just a cheap stunt to impress our guests. Richard took a deep breath, as if he were waiting for exactly that reaction. With a gesture, he turned on the projector. The screen showed images of spreadsheets, bank statements, and even photographs of suspicious meetings between Eduardo and competitors. This gentleman, Richard explained, turning to the investors, is what was really behind the merger. Not growth, not innovation, but money laundering. The Japanese investors exchanged heavy glances. Mr. Yamazaki closed the folder in front of him firmly. Patricia put her hand to her mouth, her eyes welling up with tears. Eduardo, in turn, finally lost his usual charm. His face was red, and his voice came out in a shout. You set a trap for us! Richard remained calm, his gaze penetrating like a blade. No, Eduardo, you dug your own grave. I just brought the shovel. Eduardo's shout was still echoing when the conference room door opened slowly. The metallic creak of the hinges sounded like thunder in the suffocating silence. Everyone turned, surprised. Richard just kept his calm expression, as if he already knew what was coming. And then, to everyone's amazement, a little girl with dark braids entered, accompanied by a social worker. Alice. Patricia's eyes widened so much they almost popped out of her face. Eduardo took a step back, as if he had seen a ghost. What does this mean?" he stammered, his voice trembling, sweat running down his forehead. Richard leaned slightly, introducing her with the serenity of someone showing their final card. "Gentlemen, this is Alice Brown, perhaps the most unlikely witness, but also the most important of this entire story." Alice walked with firmness to the table. Despite her young age, her posture conveyed a courage that left those present bewildered. The social worker's heels echoed behind her, but it was the girl who dominated the room. She placed a cell phone on the table and said in a clear, firm, almost defiant voice, "I was hiding when they said they were going to fool Mr. Richard. I heard everything. I recorded it too." The phrase fell like a bomb. Patricia went white as paper, her breathing short, her hands trembling with nervousness. Eduardo tried to laugh, but his laugh came out strangled, an empty sound that betrayed his panic. "Are you going to believe a street child, just any girl?" Richard didn't answer, just nodded to Alice. The girl touched the cell phone, and in seconds, the room was filled with the voices of Patricia and Eduardo. "He's a sentimental idiot. Tomorrow he won't have anything left." It was Patricia. Her cruel laughter echoed through the room like poison. Right after, Eduardo's voice emerged, filled with contempt. 15 years of pretending to be that idiot's friend. It will be worth every second when I see his face as he loses everything." The silence that followed was suffocating. The Japanese investors were stunned. Mr. Tanaka pressed his hands on the table, his gaze cold. Mr. Sato sighed, shaking his head in disapproval, while Mr. Yamazaki closed his eyes as if witnessing an irreparable shame. Patricia put her hand to her mouth, tears running down her face, smudging her makeup. Eduardo tried to form words, but only stuttered, unable to regain his composure. Alice raised her chin, her eyes shining with determination. "I saw how you talked about him, as if he were invisible. But my grandmother always said, when someone is being trampled on and you can help, you help." The entire room held its breath. Eduardo exploded. "This doesn't prove anything, it's just a setup." But his voice no longer had any strength. Richard let out a slight smile. "It's not a setup, Eduardo, it's just the truth. And the truth always finds a way to appear, even if it's in the hands of a child." The door to the room had barely closed behind Alice when it opened again, this time with force and determination. 2 federal agents entered, followed by Gabriel, the private investigator Richard had called days before. The sound of their boots echoed on the marble floor, filling the room with unquestionable authority. "We brought the additional proof," Gabriel announced, his voice deep and firm. "It's all here." He held up a voluminous folder, full of reports, spreadsheets, emails, and bank statements. Beside him, one of the agents was already holding a warrant. Patricia let out a muffled scream. "No, this can't be happening." Tears now streamed down her face, smudging her expensive makeup, and her mask of coldness had finally crumbled. Eduardo tried to react, hitting his palm on the table, making some papers fly like dry leaves. "This is a staged circus. No judge will accept this evidence. I know the law. I know influential people." He bellowed, his voice choked but no longer confident. Gabriel was unfazed. "You do know them, and that's exactly why we were thorough. Every transaction, every fake contract, every embezzlement is recorded. The Japanese investors will have a detailed copy of everything, and so will justice." The investors, who until then had been observing in silence, began to murmur among themselves. Mr. Tanaka was the first to speak, looking intently at Richard. We thank you for your transparency. It's clear. Who is worthy of trust at this table? Richard just bowed his head in respect, but his eyes didn't leave Eduardo and Patricia. For years, I considered you part of my life, and you responded with betrayal. But today, the mask came off. An agent advanced toward Eduardo, who instinctively recoiled. You are under arrest on charges of corporate fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Everything you say can and will be used against you. Patricia collapsed into the chair, sobbing loudly. Eduardo tried to break free, muttering disjointed insults, but soon his wrists were cuffed with a metallic click that echoed in the room like a final sentence. Alice watched it all, her eyes wide. For a moment, Richard feared the scene was too much for her, but the girl clenched her fists tightly and stared at the villains as they were led away. They won't hurt anyone else, will they? She asked softly. Richard knelt beside her and replied gently, No, Alice, they won't hurt anyone else. As Eduardo and Patricia were led away by the agents, the investors remained in respectful silence, as if they were witnessing not just a scandal, but also a life lesson. Some even nodded discreetly to Richard, recognizing the strength he had shown. And deep down they all knew that this was not just the end of a fraud, it was the beginning of something much bigger, a new chapter that was born from the ashes of betrayal. A few hours later, the meeting room was already empty. The silence was almost strange, as if the space still held the echoes of the confusion that had just happened. Richard remained seated at the head of the table, taking a deep breath, feeling the weight of years slowly being replaced by a new feeling, freedom. Alice was by his side, distractedly playing with the cell phone she had used to record the evidence. The girl seemed tired, but her eyes shone with something Richard hadn't seen in anyone for a long time. Hope. Gabriel entered, carrying some more documents. It's done, he said, placing them on the table. Eduardo and Patricia will be prosecuted. The press is already reporting it. Their reputation is over. Richard nodded slowly. And the company? The investigator smiled wryly. Stronger than ever. The investors cancelled the merger, but they didn't break with you. On the contrary, they're even more interested. Other investors have already requested meetings. Everyone was impressed with your stance. Richard took another deep breath. It was as if the weight of 15 years of naivety had finally been lifted from his shoulders. He looked at Alice, who was now biting into a piece of chocolate someone had given her. You know, he began, I always thought my greatest talent was trusting people, and that's what almost destroyed me. Alice looked up serious, as if she were older than she really was. My grandmother said that trusting isn't wrong. It's wrong to trust someone who doesn't deserve it. The simplicity of the phrase hit Richard like a revelation. He smiled, running a hand through the girl's hair. I think your grandmother was a very wise woman. Alice shrugged, but her eyes teared up. She said that sometimes life puts us in strange places just so we can find the people who really matter. Richard felt a lump in his throat for the first time in many years. It wasn't a contract, nor a negotiation, nor a financial victory that made him feel alive. It was that child sitting next to him, reminding him that not all wealth is measured in numbers. Gabriel cleared his throat, breaking the silence. I guess in the end, you won more than you lost, Richard. He agreed. Yes, I won something that no money can buy, a reason to believe again. Outside, the city lights shone, as if announcing a new beginning. Richard knew there would still be battles, but he was no longer alone. He looked at Alice, who smiled shyly, and said in a low voice, almost like a promise, From today on, you'll never feel invisible again. Alice rested her head on his shoulder, like someone who had finally found a home. And so, in the same place where betrayal had almost destroyed everything, a new story was born, not of power, but of trust, family, and hope.